Welcome, therapists, to the Therapist Burnout Podcast. Today, I have a wonderful guest on the show, Dr. Kevin Cokley. PhD is a University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor and the Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan, where he serves as an Associate Chair for Diversity Initiatives and primary investigator of the RACE Research on Race, Achievement, Culture, and Education Lab in the Department of Psychology. His research and teaching can be broadly categorized in the area of African American psychology, with a focus on racial identity and understanding the psychological and environmental factors that impact African American students' academic achievement. Dr. Cokley studies the psychosocial experiences of African American students and students of color, and is currently exploring the imposter phenomenon and its relationship to mental health and academic outcomes, something I'm very interested to learn more as a practicing school psychologist. So I'm really interested actually in hearing more about that research. He is the editor of the 2024 book, The Imposter Phenomenon, Psychological Research, Theory, and Interventions. He has written several op-eds, one in which I hope to talk a little bit about on today's show, in major media outlets on topics such as defending DEI, critical race theory, and Black Lives Matter movement. With all of those accolades, Dr. Cokley, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much, Dr. Blanchette, for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, I'm so honored to have you on and for the listeners to hear a little bit about your research and your advocacy. So thank you for your work.
Glad to be here.
Well, maybe let's just start off by talking about imposter phenomenon. So it's something that I talk about often on my show because it's something I experienced very acutely in burnout. So you may not know me as well, but I talk about on my podcast leaving private practice as a therapist in an extreme bout of burnout. And through that process, I felt a great deal of imposterism about my abilities, about my training. And I talk often about that and hear that from the listeners that they are feeling a great deal of imposterism in their work as therapists. So I wonder if you might just share a little bit about imposter phenomenon, which sometimes we hear as syndrome, as just kind of laying the land there and then diving into other aspects of your research.
Yeah, and actually, before, if you don't mind, before I just sort of just dive right into that, I'd like
Yeah.
to tell you how I came upon this idea of the imposter phenomenon and why I started doing work in the area for your listeners. So, as you mentioned in the intro, my work has primarily focused on broadly African American psychology, particularly with African American students. I've always been very interested in issues pertaining to their achievement, their identity, how they navigate being in predominantly white spaces. And so, for if you look at the research that I've published, you'll see those themes present throughout much of my research, early part of my research. And I happened to be doing a literature review, and I don't even remember what I was searching for exactly, but I was using PsycInfo database, and as I was doing this search, I came across this article that talked about this idea of the imposter phenomenon, and I wasn't very familiar with it, and but reading the abstract, it sounded very interesting, and so I, you know, read the article, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this idea of the imposter phenomenon. First of all, it personally resonated with me. When I reflected back on my experiences as an undergraduate student at Wake Forest University many years ago, I thought to myself, wow, like, so that's what I was experiencing. I didn't have the language for it at the time, but now in retrospect, I could see that what I was feeling and experiencing as an undergraduate student, as a black male undergraduate student in this predominantly white elite academic space, I was experiencing imposter feelings. And so I got excited as I became aware that I now have this new idea that really fits very well into the program of research that I have been conducting. And so it was at that moment that I decided that I was going to start to do research on the imposter phenomenon, as it, particularly as it relates to the experiences of African American and other racially minoritized students. So I think it's helpful for people to know how I sort of got into this work. And then to your question, how do I define, or how is the imposter phenomenon sort of defined. And, of course, my understanding of it, comes directly from the source, Pauline Clance herself, who, who along with Suzanne Imes created this idea. And the imposter phenomenon, the way that I like to explain it is the idea that the individuals who are, very accomplished, capable, competent, intelligent people, nevertheless feel like they are intellectually fraudulent. The way that I
Mm.
like to sort of talk about it is, if it's almost as if people could look within the windows of their soul, they would see someone who is not nearly as competent the as they present, as their accomplishments would suggest, and they have really sort of internalized this idea that they are just walking around kind of like fooling people. They really don't have the self confidence of themselves that their accomplishments would seem to suggest that they should have. So in a nutshell, that's the way that I sort of understand what the imposter phenomenon means.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving the context to that and your own kind of experience of that. And when I heard you on Speaking of Psychology podcast, is where I first found your work. I was really taken aback that this is a very common experience. So I wonder if you can kind of speak to how common the experience is in just the general population, then maybe talk a little bit how that might differ in different groups of people.
Yeah, experiencing the imposter phenomenon is very popular. For a long time, the statistic that you would hear sort of quoted was that approximately 70% of people at some point in time have experienced imposter feelings. There was an article that I was a co-author on where we did a massive literature review, and it really, that number is actually higher. It's actually around 80% of people, at least according to our literature review, that have experienced imposter feelings. And then when I give talks, and I give quite a few talks on the imposter phenomenon, one of the first questions that I ask the audience is, how many of you have at any point in time during the course of your life, how many of you have ever experienced or felt like an imposter? And
Mm.
in those instances, I would say that it's typically at least 90% of the hands in those audiences are raised. So suffice it
Mm.
to say that imposter feelings are quite common and quite sort of prevalent amongst a lot of different people. And then to the second part of your question about different subgroups, you see evidence of it across different demographics. Whether first of all, I'll sort of provide the historical context. When Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes initially were studying the imposter phenomenon, of course they were studying it. They observed it amongst women of various professional and educational backgrounds, predominantly white women, but again they all had in common that they were very successful, but did not fully internalize that success. And so they initially thought that imposter feelings would be more prevalent amongst women than men. Research has really been somewhat equivocal around that. You have some studies that say that find that women are more likely to report imposter feelings than men. You have other studies that find really that there's no difference. Even in my own work, I have reported both findings. But a recent meta-analysis has now sort of confirmed that what Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes initially sort of suspected, that women, in fact, do tend to report higher imposter feelings relative
Oh,
to men.
interesting.
So that's that meta analysis. I think was published maybe a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Uh, so that's it's good to know, but that's not to say that men don't and can't experience imposter feelings, because they certainly do. But it's just that they tend to be more prevalent or more prevalently reported, by women. So there's that gender piece, and then of course there's the cultural race ethnicity piece, and this is really interesting and fairly complicated. I don't want to take your readers down my whole sort of like rabbit hole of like sort of the minutia of research that we've done.
I
So
mean, so
I'll try to.
80% of my listeners tend to be female identifying. I think that like understanding
Okay.
that context is helpful for them, and also just I think they're just curious humans, the people that listen to my podcast. So
Okay.
they're working with different groups, and I think they'd want to know, who, as therapists, they'd want to know if I have a client with this identity or that identity, what they be struggling with, and how can I support them in that.
Yeah. Well, no, that's helpful, and certainly imposter feelings, as you might imagine, are quite prevalent amongst different sort of marginalized populations, especially amongst racially and ethnically minoritized folks. There is what we are still trying to sort of better understand is if there are differences amongst different racially and ethnically minoritized groups. So, for example, there have been several studies, my studies and other studies that have indicated that Asian American folks tend to report higher levels of imposter feelings relative to African Americans or Latinx and Native Indigenous folks. That finding hasn't always been sort of consistent, but it's been reported enough such that people think that there might be something to that. There are also some methodological challenges with those studies that would cause one to maybe hold off on making that statement definitively. And I won't get into that minutia, but suffice it to say that folks of color definitely are especially susceptible to these imposter feelings, and that is related to a lot of the work that I have started to do in recent years.
Yeah, and do you find differences? I think you also, part of your work is also looking at if they are in an environment that is predominantly white. So, will that increase imposterism, increase imposter syndrome? And especially for me, who, works as a school psychologist, and I live in Maine. So, we have very low diversity in the state that I live in. And so, I'm just curious for those who are in a minority population, perhaps, if they are experiencing different levels of imposterism related to the environment they're in.
Yeah, we know that being in certain types of environments um, make marginalized individuals particularly susceptible to imposter feelings. Being in environments, as you sort of mentioned, predominant. If you are a racially minoritized individual and being in predominantly white environments, that is certainly a very um, sort of consequential, a very significant place to be, to have these sort of feelings. Um, One of the things that I sort of talk about when I give these talks is, being in environments that are highly competitive, where you find yourself sort of amongst other people who are very sort of competitive. That is a breeding ground for imposter feelings. Relatedly, being in environments where there are high stakes, or being in occupations where there are high stakes. I'm thinking, for example, like the medical profession is obviously a example where you have to be careful not to make mistakes. But you can be in certain types of environments that really lend themselves to feeling like an imposter. And so I guess the point is that when you are sort of understanding imposter feelings, that you should always sort of understand it within a certain context, a certain sort of psychological and social context. And this probably goes beyond perhaps what you intend to cover, but I think it's important to point out that that some people have been maybe very critical of the concept. And I don't know if you were planning to go there or not, but it's
I go
important.
over wherever we're comfortable going. I'm happy to talk about anything you're wanting to talk about.
Well, some folks, have been very critical of the concept of the imposter phenomenon because they believe that it essentially blames the victim, that it focuses too much on the individual and makes the individual responsible for their imposter feelings, and doesn't focus enough on the environmental contributions to people feeling like imposters. And as a result, some people have been dismissive of the concept. And my sort of response is, first, if you go back and if you read very carefully the origins of the concept, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes were pretty clear that at least with the women, part of what contributed to their imposter feelings was what they sort of referred to as the gender roles, the stereotypes around gender that certainly, especially during the 70s, were quite prominent, that contributed to women's imposter feelings. And so they were always clear about the larger social context that imposter feelings emerged, particularly among women. This has sort of gotten lost, particularly in the popular culture sort of discussion of imposterism, which makes it then easily sort of picked on or sort of dismissed, because people don't talk enough about the environmental sort of
Totally.
circumstances.
I am so with this because I think in the context of burnout, which I talk about all the time, there are so many self-care trainings and interventions targeted at the individual. Like, well, if we were doing more self-care and doing, X, Y, and Z, then you wouldn't be struggling with your burnout. And I can see it similarly for imposter feelings. Like, well, maybe there's something wrong with you. Maybe you need to go to therapy, and we're not looking at what are the systems and structures. And particularly in me working as a trauma therapist for much of my career, also what are those traumatic situations maybe that we're exposed to as well, that are coming from the system, from the culture that they're in, that might be increasing that situation, might be increasing the burnout. And for therapists specifically, the exposure to traumatic material certainly is just enough to create situations that can create burnout, for example. So I wonder if, like, in your research, you kind of see similar themes regarding systems and how that can set up situations where people are more likely, because of exposure to invalidating messages or people telling them things that are making them question themselves, like almost gaslighting, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And in fact, what we have done in our research is we have introduced the idea of a racialized imposter phenomenon.
Yeah.
And we say that this racialized imposter phenomenon is really, it's like an internal experience of intellectual and professional self-doubt that occurs among racially and ethnically minoritized individuals because of racist environments.
Mhm.
So we make it really explicit in this sort of this new sort of construct, or we take the original construct and we really sort of revise it in ways to make it more um, responsive to the impacts of the environment on racially ethnically minoritized individuals. And we have created a new scale, the racialized imposter phenomenon scale, to go and to be used to measure really the impact of sort of what we believe to be the messages that racially and ethnically minoritized individuals oftentimes have to sort of contend with.
Yeah. And I'm just even wondering, like, over time, where there has been more of these, there's been more racism in our politics and the current climate that we're in, with DEI being abolished from many institutions, including the APA. I'm kind of segueing a little bit, but I'm wondering about, even in this current moment, if we have any recent research based on the reactions that people might be experiencing, that may be experiencing racial trauma that has happened over the 2020s.
Yeah, I think that research is forthcoming. I've heard that question asked quite a bit. Like, do we know what has been the result of all of this sort of anti DEI, sort of the climate and the dismantling of DEI? What has been the actual impact? And I think that is being determined now.
Yeah, I think it would be just interesting to know. I mean, I think what has been the impacts of that, and what are people feeling with regard to, I think, psychological safety, how is their mental health impacted, those types of things.
Well, I can give you just maybe one quick example. The We know that if you think about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and if I were to focus just on the inclusion piece just for a moment, in the college context, what that looked like was having activities and programming that really targeted, different racially and ethnically minoritized groups, um, to kind of help them feel like this was an environment, where they can have a stronger sense of belonging. They can feel
Mhm.
like they were truly being valued and included. So, for example, um, like orientation, uh, activity. So like, at the beginning of each year, in many institutions across the country, you'll have different orientation events. And for many places, they would have orientation events that specifically targeted, say, Black students, Latinx students, and Asian students, et cetera. But now with this dismantling of DEI, institutions are like, we can't do that because, that's now seen as being discriminatory because you don't have specific orientation events for white individuals, for example. And so getting rid of those sorts of events that were intended to make marginalized students feel welcomed and included, that has had a really negative impact on those students because now they question whether they in fact do belong, whether the institution really does value their presence and want them there. And there are numerous examples that we could sort of provide, but that's just a real obvious example of how the impact of the dismantling of DEI has a direct impact on really marginalized folks.
Yeah, I just think that we're going to be still figuring out how this time period, COVID, and then racial reckoning, Black Lives Matter, all of this really is going to impact society as a whole and marginalized populations, I think, in the coming years and decades even. I think it will be at a time that we kind of refer back to. I do kind of, it somewhat adjacent, but I know you just recently this week talked about on Psychology Today an article about the dismantling of SEMRAT, which was APA's, and I'm not going to remember all the acronym because I don't have it in front of me and I don't have my glasses today, but maybe you can help me with that because you wrote an article on it about them dismantling this initiative in the APA, American Psychological Association, which for me feels like we should be leading the initiative in these matters. And so my reaction was, what are we doing here? Disbelief. And so I just wanted to get your reactions on the article and also your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah. So we wrote. So my spouse and I have been longtime, members of the American Psychological Association, and she is the current president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, and I am a past president of that organization. And it was brought to her attention that the APA had recently announced that it was disbanding CHEMRAT, which stands for the Commission on Ethnic Minority Recruitment, Retention, and Training. This initiative has been, an APA for a number of years, and its purpose was to provide support, seed funding for diversifying psychology. Many folks had benefited from the seed funding over time, and so the becoming aware that it was now being disbanded, and they provided some reasons which we did not find particularly compelling, but it was really disappointing, and if I'm being honest, it was angering for us. So we decided to write this piece for Psychology Today, to give it a broader audience, to really be critical of APA, and we did this for a few reasons. One, APA has continues to claim that it values diversity, equity, inclusion. If you can go on their websites and you'll see evidence of this claim, and yet it is engaging in behaviors and actions that are counter to that claim. One of the things that we talked about in the article was last year APA announced that regarding its accreditation of standards, that it was relaxing the standards for diversity for accreditation purposes. And those of us, I'm trained as a counselor psychologist, so those of us who are in the part of AP, who are part of psychology where you're training mental health providers, we understand the importance of accreditation and accreditation standards. For many, many years, I used to teach multicultural counseling because, again, it was important that we train mental health professionals who are culturally competent. But then to have APA relax,
So tell me have those new standards come into place, like for APA accredited programs, like for me who graduated for APA accredited program in clinical psychology, are those standards where I had to have my multicultural class? Is that relaxed where it's like optional or it's like an elective now?
That's my understanding. I mean, that is
Wow.
my understanding. And so I was contacted by the New York Times. I'm not sure how they got my name, but I was contacted, and I said, and I was quoted as saying that it was absolutely unconscionable that APA um, would would relax its standards around diversity, given what we know to be the importance of having diverse mental health providers for the diverse communities that that are being served.
Of course.
Um, so that's one example. Obviously the the disbanding of Kimrad, and it really, what it speaks to is, and the APA is not alone in this. I mean, we're seeing it with institutions across the country that really are sort of succumbing to these, what many of us believe to be unlawful sort of mandates to dismantle DEI everywhere. And we expected more from APA given what they claim to be their values, but APA has unfortunately proven itself to not be any different than many of these other institutions that are following suit.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I think a sign of the times, unfortunately, that we're seeing this in the institutions where a lot of us were trained and looked to for information on leadership and what we should be aspiring to as a profession.
Yeah.
And so who do we look to if we can't trust these organizations to lead us in what we need to aspire to? What advice would you have for a psychologist? I think because I'm a psychologist, but a lot of I have counselors, I have social workers that listen to this. Hopefully the social work association, which I haven't been affiliated much with because I'm a psychologist, but where should we look in these times?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I would look to, for example, the leadership of the ethnic psychological associations, because they remain firm in their commitment to diversity, because obviously their organizations represent very diverse communities and constituencies. The Association of Black Psychologists, the Asian American Psychological Association, the National Latinx Psychological Association, Society for Indigenous Psychologists, and so many others, or a few others. They will continue maintaining their commitment to their respective communities. There certainly are individuals within APA and other entities that are not happy about the stance that APA is taking, and I think that one should maintain their embrace of diversity, their sort of personal and professional embrace of diversity, regardless of what messaging they are, sort of symbolic actions they see from entities like APA. Because those of you who are on the ground, who are actually doing the work, you don't need APA to tell you the importance of diversity
Yeah.
and understanding and recognizing diversity in your work. So regardless of actions done by APA, you know directly firsthand why it's important that we continue to embrace diversity and equity and inclusion.
Well, very well said. Very well said. I wonder if I can segue us a little bit into imposterism and burnout. So, where the intersection happens, you spoke a little bit about this in your book that you authored. Why do you think those feelings might come up more when someone's experiencing acute bouts of burnout or kind of on the edge of burnout? Because you talked a little bit about environments and situations like that. So, I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, the book, for your listeners, is an edited book, and the author of that chapter was not actually me. It was Dr. Lizette Oeda. When I reached out to her, I actually became aware that she had done some work around the imposter phenomenon and burnout, and so I invited her to contribute a chapter, and of course she did, and so she was the one who actually wrote the chapter. But I think that it there's a natural, I was going to say, I don't know if marriage is the right word, but there's a natural link between imposterism and burnout. When individuals experience, sort of burnout, and number of things that sort of contribute to burnout, including like being a workaholic, certain situations where you're having to make decisions and you're somewhat indecisive. Perfectionism is a strong core, and specifically maladaptive perfectionism, because there are forms of perfectionism that aren't necessarily harmful.
I heard you talk about this before, because I guess part of me when I hear perfectionism, I hear bad, you know? So, and the research are probably like psychologically and in therapy as a therapist, I'm like, perfectionism probably isn't the best thing for someone to experience. However, maybe in the research and literature, it looks different regarding to like how it positively or negatively loads.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, and you're right. I mean, I think that when you hear sort of like just perfectionism, like in the abstract, you're probably most likely to be inclined to sort of think of it in this negative context, or in the maladaptive context. But they're researchers of perfectionism, and they use different sort of terminology. But some of them, talk about a more sort of adaptive form of perfectionism, where essentially, and I'm just sort of like paraphrasing, individuals who who strive to be the very best that they can be, to do the very best work that they can do, but they do so sort of like realistically. Like, in other words, they don't hold themselves to unrealistically high standards, but they strive to do is it's almost like they strive for quote unquote perfection, but they do so in a way that recognizes that they're not perfect, and it's okay to not be perfect, but you're still striving to be as good as you can be, versus those individuals who see themselves as failures if they are not literally like perfect, if they don't if
Yeah.
they don't reach this unrealistic standard of like perfection that no human being can reach. Hopefully you can maybe see the difference. We know that when you have this more maladaptive form of perfectionism, it's associated with a number of negative psychological outcomes, and whereas more adaptive forms of perfectionism tend to not be associated with negative outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm almost what I'm hearing is like if you have an adaptive form of perfectionism, you're still striving to do really good work, right? You really want to do good work and it's important to you, but you do it in a way that fits into your humanity. So that's my interpretation of what you said and how maybe if someone has that, like many of the people that listen to this, that were probably like the high achievers, they got the good grade, they got their license as a counselor or as a psychologist, and that drive that got them there, that had them achieve that level. And I listened to another podcast where you talked about, kind of overworking to like reach some of the accolades and to reach the places that you had to kind of get yourself there. And I also identify with kind of needing to like get to that point of achieving in some regards, you kind of have to sit with yourself because you can only do that for so long.
No, exactly. And another way to sort of think about this sort of more adaptive sort of form of perfectionism is the individual who strives to be excellent, but when they don't always reach the level that they're striving for, they're not overly self-critical. They give
Yeah.
themselves grace, because sometimes we can be our own worst critics. And so it's like pursuing excellence, but you still are somewhat flexible, and you're self-compassionate, and you give yourself grace if you don't reach that very, very high bar.
Yeah. That's really good. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like so many things that I want to ask you in the short amount of time with regard to burnout. I am curious about imposterism specifically in mental health professionals. Like, do we have much research on that? Do we understand about that population at all? It may not be an area for research.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I haven't come across necessarily a lot of research looking at imposterism amongst mental health professionals themselves, but I could easily see why there should be research in that area, particularly for mental health professionals who are maybe earlier in their careers, and maybe
Yeah.
don't have necessarily the self-confidence that they know what they're doing.
And we know their rates of burnout are higher than mid-career or later career professionals. So early
Okay.
career professionals experiencing higher levels of burnout. So I would extrapolate that we might see higher levels of imposterism. So I would love to do research in that area if I was at a university, but I work in I work in a higher education. I work in high school.
Well, no, I
Go ahead.
think that you're right. A few years ago, I did a talk with a group of lawyers. They were mostly black and other sort of, and we also collected some data with them. And one of the things that we've learned was that imposterism was was much higher for lawyers earlier in their careers than lawyers who were seasoned and had been at it for like 15, 10, 15, 20 years or so. So I would perhaps extrapolate from that we might see the same, with mental health providers as well.
Yeah, so much. And I also want to do some, I don't know who's going to do this research. I know you're at a university. Can you get some grad students to do some research on therapist mental health? Because as I had done some literature reviews for my podcast to give information to my listeners, there is a dearth of research on the actual mental health rates of mental health providers. So if they could do like a study with imposterism and all of that, I would love to collaborate with anyone and just learn more because I couldn't find much research on actual mental health rates, which we have with like the American Medical Association. They have like rates of depression, anxiety, suicidality. And so I just think it is crazy that we don't have this data on mental health professionals. So just a PSA if anyone wants to do that research.
Yeah, I,
Yeah.
I I agree.
So anyway, I wonder, as we're closing, I know it's just a question in the back of my mind that how can this research happen? As we're closing, I wonder, I usually ask my guests kind of if there's one thing you could tell a therapist, is there anything that you would tell them?
Yes, I think there is. I would tell them that they should be intentional in assessing or evaluating or determining whether their clients are experiencing imposter feelings. And I say that because one of the things that we do know, at least from clinical context, is that when you are working with clients, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that maybe Pauline Clance herself talked about this, in her own clinical work. But you don't typically, clients aren't coming to you telling you that they have their presenting issues are not, I have imposter feelings. That's not typically what happens. And it's really the therapist, as they're sort of like listening to the client, and then their sort of clinical instincts, intuition, you sort of gather from what is being said that this is probably something that the client is experiencing, but they don't have the language. That's not how they are conceptualizing at least part of what they're sort of struggling with. So I would encourage therapists to be intentional in looking for, sort of signs that their clients might be experiencing imposter feelings, because more often than not, the clients aren't going to necessarily sort of state that directly.
Yeah, oh, that's a good point. I wonder how, for me, that would come up probably with burnout, with depression. I might think of that with some anxiety that I might think to assess for some of that stuff. But I'm wondering if there's,
Mhm.
we could talk forever. So I just have to have another conversation when our schedules meet up at some future juncture. But at this point, I'm wondering where people can follow up with you and hear more about your work.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, I did publish a book, an edited book, "The Imposter Phenomenon: Psychological Research, Theory, and Interventions," published by the American Psychological Association, the APA. But that book is a good place to to get familiar with the work in general around imposterism. Obviously, there are a number of contributors, so it's not just like my work, but it's a
Yeah,
good place to, if you want to just become more familiar with the state of the art
it's
of
very good. I
research.
purchased a copy as well. Very good.
So thank you. And I'm a pretty public figure, so if you Google me, you will be able to, I think, see lots of references to the work that I've done, both my public scholarship, which is in the form of op-eds, opinion editorials, as well as my more sort of formal academic research. Be able to easily sort of see references to that.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I know a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.